Chapter 9. The Story of Jamaica. Jamaica was visited by Columbus in 1494. He called it San Yago, but the island has kept a form of its Arawak name, Zamaca. In 1509, the Spaniards took possession of the island. They destroyed nearly all the Arawaks, but as they used the island for cattle farms, the number of Spanish settlers was small. In 1655, Oliver Cromwell was ruling in England. He had defeated the Dutch and then turned his attention to the Spaniards. He sent Admiral Penn and General Venables to attack the Spaniards in the West Indies and to seize some of their islands. Hispaniola was to be attacked first. Penn and Venables were poor leaders, and their men were rough, untrained, and disorderly. When the fleet anchored in Hall's Bay, Barbados, some of the sailors went ashore and did much damage to the sugar canes. This enraged the colonists, but between 3,000 to 4,000 men were recruited for the expedition, and over 1,000 from St. Kitts and Nevis. The fleet now moved to attack Hispaniola. It was decided to land soldiers and marines at a spot about 30 miles from San Domingo, while the fleet moved up within range of the forts. This attempt was a complete failure. The men got out of hand, advanced towards the city much too quickly, and were cut off from their base. When night fell, they panicked, thinking they heard the rattling of Spanish sabers moving up to attack. The strange sound was actually the rustling made by an army of land crabs. The men wasted their shots, firing at random into the dark woods. Later they fell into a Spanish ambush and were shamefully repulsed by a small force of the enemy. They regained their ships with difficulty and in complete rout. When Penn offered to batter down the fort with the guns of the fleet and land the men in the town, the men were too badly shaken, and it was decided to take them on board and sail away. The two leaders had no wish to return to England and to Cromwell, with a tale of a complete defeat. They steered for Jamaica and decided to make an attempt on that island. Soldiers were landed, expecting stiff resistance, but they marched towards the town of San Yago, the capital now called Spanish Town, without being seriously opposed. If the enemy had behaved himself manfully, wrote Venables, he might have worsted us. A few days later, a Spaniard bearing a white flag came to the British outposts and asked for a treaty to be made. So Jamaica became British without fighting and without glory on either side. All this happened in 1655. The English found the island overrun by wild horses and cattle, descendants of animals brought there by the Spaniards in early days and allowed to escape to the open country. The cattle might have been of great value as food, but they were killed without plan or order, and some 20,000 animals were actually killed off in 4 months. The early days of the new colony were far from promising. The soldiers had destroyed cattle and food. They would neither dig nor plant, wrote one of Cromwell's officials sent out to report, but they were determined rather to starve than work. The first colonists were not used to the climate, and they died off like flies. Indeed, the colony did not begin to prosper until after 1660, when experienced settlers from the Leeward Islands arrived. The Spaniards tried to win back Jamaica in 1657 and again in 1658, when they landed on the north coast. The governor, Edward D'Oyly, called upon them to surrender. When the Spanish commander refused to do so, D'Oyly ordered an attack. The Spanish fort was stormed with scaling ladders, the garrison driven out with hand grenades, and chased for 3 miles along the beach. So the Spaniards withdrew, leaving 100 prisoners in the hands of the English. When Penn and Venables first arrived in Jamaica, the defeated Spanish armed their Negro slaves and set them free. They retreated in large numbers to the mountainous parts of the islands, especially the Cockpit country. Those slaves who escaped to freedom came to be called Maroons, probably from a Spanish word, cimarron, meaning dwellers amid the summits. The number of Maroons grew all through the days of slavery, as they were often joined by runaway slaves from the colonists. They were a great source of trouble to the colonists, raiding outlying settlements, and the Assembly spent 240,000 sterling in 75 years in vain efforts to defeat them. The Maroons were a threat to the colonists and organized raids on the plantations. There was much irregular fighting, and two wars were waged against them. The first was carried on in the 1730s, but in the wooded, mountainous country, the Maroons were able to repulse all attacks, and a truce had to be declared. One historian describes how Dr. Russell, with the British troops, dressed in the finery of the day, came forward to parley with Captain Pujo, the old Maroon leader, who was clad in rags. Russell held out his hand, which Pujo took. To display their friendly intentions, they exchanged hats. A treaty was signed shortly after under a tree in Trelawney Town, which granted the Maroons their freedom and large areas of land, particularly in the cockpit country. There was peace for many years, but in 1795, some of the Maroons, displeased with their treatment, organized a big rising. Again, blood was shed, and this time the Maroons were defeated. Those who had fought were sent to Nova Scotia and then to Sierra Leone, a colony for freed slaves in West Africa. Maroons are still in the cockpit country, and their descendants are among the leaders of Sierra Leone today. But in Jamaica, the slaves had to wait until 1834 before they gained their freedom. From then onwards, the history of Jamaica is that of a free people, at first working under great difficulties, and even now with many problems springing from the past as well as from the present. From the first days of freedom, many of the Negroes left the plantations and settled wherever they could in free villages or even in the bush. Others remained on the plantations and worked as paid laborers. But it was not until 1866 that a really constructive effort was made to organize the new Jamaica. A year before, in 1865, had occurred the Morant Bay Rising under Governor Eyre. The rising had largely been caused by the poor conditions of the peasants and their unsatisfied land hunger. It was put down very harshly, and Governor Eyre was recalled for this. The new governor, Sir John Peter Grant, set about settling the people on the land with great vigor. His measures did a lot to improve conditions in Jamaica. Roads and bridges were built. The churches were given money to help with their schools. The railway was extended. The post office was set up. And it was then that the constabulary and the public works department came into being. All felt a spirit of progress was in the air. It was at this time, too, that new crops began to be planted as well as the sugarcane, cinchona, coconut palms, and most important of all, bananas. A little later, the research station at Hope was set up. By the end of the century, Jamaica began to be prosperous again. Jamaica was affected by World War I between 1914 and 1918, and many Jamaicans served in the British West Indies Regiment. The Jamaica Producers Association was founded in 1929 with the aim of helping peasant farmers to market their crops on a cooperative basis. In 1944, during World War II, Jamaica was granted a new constitution under which every grown man and woman can vote. The future is now, more than ever, in the hands of Jamaica.